somewhere off the coast of Gujarat, India, is planning to build a wall across the sea. Not a breakwater, not a harbor barrier, a dam. 60 kilometers of concrete and rock, stretching from one side of the Gulf of Khambhat to the other, sealing off an entire arm of the Arabian Sea to trap fresh water behind it. The reservoir would hold roughly 8 billion cubic meters. The cost estimate sits above $14 billion, and the idea has been sitting on paper for 50 years. It's called Kalpasar. In May 2026, during a state visit to the Netherlands, Prime Minister Narendra Modi signed a letter of intent for technical cooperation on the project. The Dutch built something similar a century ago. India's version would be twice as long, in an environment twice as hostile, with stakes that go far beyond water supply. If it gets built, it will be the largest coastal reservoir on Earth. If it fails, the consequences could be catastrophic. This is the story of a project that rewrites geography. Gujarat has a water problem that doesn't make sense at first glance. 4 rivers empty into the Gulf of Khambhat: the Narmada, the Mahi, the Sabarmati, the Dhadar. Every monsoon season, billions of cubic meters of fresh water pour down from the highlands and flow straight into the sea, mixing with salt water and becoming useless within hours. Meanwhile, the Saurashtra Peninsula just west of the Gulf is one of the most drought-prone regions in India. Limited rivers, erratic monsoons, groundwater levels falling year after year, farmers watch their fields crack, cities ration supply, and a few dozen kilometers away, fresh water flows past them into the ocean. The logic of Kalpasar is almost childlike in its simplicity. Build a dam across the mouth of the Gulf. Trap the river water before it mixes with the sea. Let the reservoir sit. The salt water inside will flush out gradually as fresh water flows in. Within a few years, the Gulf becomes a lake. A freshwater lake, 2,000 square kilometers wide, fed by 4 rivers, sitting inside Indian territory, available year-round. The benefits stack up fast. Irrigation for over 1 million hectares of farmland. Drinking water for cities across Saurashtra. Industrial supply for refineries and chemical plants. A road link across the top of the dam that cuts the drive from Saurashtra to South Gujarat from 240 kilometers down to 60. Fisheries in the reservoir, possibly tidal or hydropower generation. One structure, half a dozen uses. The problem is the Gulf itself. The Gulf of Khambhat is shaped like a funnel. At its southern opening, where it meets the Arabian Sea, it stretches roughly 180 kilometers wide. As you move north, it narrows. The funnel shape does something unusual to the tides. Twice a day, water from the Arabian Sea rushes into the Gulf. The narrowing coastline compresses the flow. The tidal range, the distance between high and low tide, reaches 11 meters in some areas. Most coastlines see 1 to 3 meters. 11 meters means the water level rises and falls the height of a 3-story building, twice a day, every day. That tidal force creates currents, fast currents. Water accelerates as it funnels inward, carrying massive volumes of sediment. The Gulf is one of the most silt-laden bodies of water in India. The sediment doesn't settle, it stays suspended, churning in the flow, scouring anything in its path. Any structure built in that environment has to withstand not just the weight of water, but the grinding action of millions of tons of sediment moving at speed twice a day. And then there's the seismic risk. The Gulf of Khambhat sits in an active fault zone. The 2001 Bhuj earthquake, which killed over 20,000 people, had its epicenter less than 300 kilometers away. A dam built across the Gulf would need to survive not just tides and currents, but the possibility of a major earthquake shifting the ground beneath it. There's a reason this matters, beyond engineering difficulty. Gujarat has seen what happens when a major dam fails. In August 1979, the Makchu 2 Dam in Morbi district collapsed after days of extreme monsoon flooding. The reservoir behind it held far less water than Kalpasar would. When the dam broke, A wall of water hit the downstream town within 20 minutes. Death toll estimates vary widely. Official figures said around 1,800. Independent assessments ran as high as 25,000. The Guinness Book of Records listed it as the deadliest dam burst in history. Kalpasar would hold magnitudes more water. Thedum would sit upstream of heavily populated coastline. If the structure failed during a storm surge or earthquake, the wave would reach shore in minutes. The scale of potential loss is difficult to think about clearly, which is partly why the project sat dormant for so long. But sitting dormant is different from being forgotten. The idea was first proposed in 1975. It appeared in state planning documents. It was studied, it was revised, cost estimates were updated, and it never moved past the planning stage because no one in India had ever built anything remotely similar, and the technical risk was impossible to price accurately. What changed in 2026 was the realization that someone else had already done it. The Netherlands, in 1932, completed a 32-kilometer dam called the Afsluitdijk. It sealed off an arm of the North Sea called the Zuiderzee and converted it into a freshwater lake. The Dutch had been fighting the sea for centuries, building dikes and polders, reclaiming land inch by inch. The Afsluitdijk was the largest single project in that history. It worked. The lake is still there. The road across the dam is still in use. And the Netherlands became the world's undisputed expert in coastal engineering. When Modi visited the Netherlands in May 2026, the Kalpasar project was part of the discussion. The Dutch government and engineering firms agreed to provide technical cooperation. A letter of intent was signed. Gujarat's government framed it as the breakthrough the project needed. Someone who had done this before was finally willing to help India do it at twice the scale. Twice the scale, but not twice the difficulty, more like 10 times. The Afsluitdijk was built in a relatively calm, enclosed sea with mild tides and no cyclone risk. The North Sea has storms, but nothing like the Arabian Sea. The Gulf of Khambhat faces cyclones that generate storm surges several meters high on top of the already extreme tidal range. A storm surge hitting at high tide could put water levels 15 meters above normal. The dam would need to be built high enough and strong enough to absorb that without overtopping or buckling. The Dutch expertise is real, but it solves only part of the problem. The Afsluitdijk taught the world how to build a stable barrier in open water, how to manage sluices for controlled flushing, how to prevent differential settling in soft seabed sediment. It did not teach anyone how to build in an environment where the tidal force is 3 times stronger, or how to anchor a structure in sediment that never stops moving, or how to design for cyclones and earthquakes simultaneously. The knowledge transfer is valuable. It is not a blueprint. And then there's what happens after the dam is built. Assume the structure holds. Assume the gates work. Assume the reservoir begins to fill and the salt gradually flushes out over several monsoon cycles. You now have a 2,000 square kilometer freshwater lake in a region that desperately needs it. You also have a trap. The Gulf of Khambhat, before the dam, was a partially self-cleaning system. Tides flushed pollutants out to sea twice a day. After the dam, there is no flushing. The rivers feeding the reservoir carry agricultural runoff, industrial effluent, and urban sewage. The Sabarmati flows through Ahmedabad, one of India's largest cities. The Mahi and Narmada pass through heavily industrialized zones. The water coming in is not clean. In an open gulf, dilution and tidal exchange disperse the load. In a closed reservoir, it accumulates. The pollution concern is not theoretical. The Sabarmati, Mahi, and several tributaries feeding the proposed reservoir are already classified among the most polluted rivers in India, with heavy metal concentrations, chemical residues, and bacterial counts well above safe thresholds. Close the Gulf, and all of that has nowhere to go. The reservoir would require continuous treatment infrastructure, filtration, and possibly seasonal drawdowns to prevent toxic buildup. The cost of managing water quality inside the reservoir could rival the cost of building the dam itself. Then there's the salt problem in reverse. The reservoir will take years to fully desalinate. During that transition period, the water will be brackish, too salty for irrigation, too salty for drinking, borderline usable for industry. The plan assumes that patient waiting and river inflow will solve this, but seawater doesn't flush out evenly. The density differences create stratification. Heavier saltwater sinks. Lighter freshwater floats on top. You can end up with a lens of relatively fresh water at the surface and a dead hypersaline layer below, anoxic and biologically sterile. That stratification can persist for decades if the reservoir isn't actively mixed. The Dutch dealt with this in the Zuiderzee by installing pumps and sluices to accelerate circulation. Kalpasar would need the same, scaled up, in a far larger and deeper body of water, under a tropical sun that drives evaporation rates far higher than northern Europe. And while the reservoir gradually freshens, the ecological consequences outside the dam compound. The Gulf of Khambhat supports one of the richest fishing zones on India's west coast. Fisheries depend on the mixing of nutrient-rich river water with seawater, on tidal marshes, on estuarine spawning grounds. Close the Gulf and you eliminate the estuary. Fish species that migrate between river and sea, including commercially valuable catches like hilsa and certain prawns, lose access. Juvenile fish that depend on brackish nurseries lose habitat. The fishing communities around the Gulf, already economically marginal, lose their livelihood. Compensation schemes have been discussed. They are not detailed, they are not funded, and they do not replace an ecosystem. Environmental clearance for Kalpasar has been sought. It has not been granted. Previous assessments flagged these concerns. The state government submitted updated plans in mid-2026. The detailed project report reached its final stage in late 2025. But environmental approval for projects of this scale in India often takes years, and approval does not mean the concerns were resolved. It often means they were deemed acceptable trade-offs. The question is whether the trade-off is actually being made by the people who will pay the cost. There is another layer to this that has nothing to do with engineering or ecology. It is strategic, and it is rarely stated outright. India's northern rivers, the Brahmaputra, the Indus tributaries, even parts of the Ganges basin, originate outside Indian territory. China controls the Tibetan Plateau. Pakistan controls upstream segments of the Indus. In a region where water is becoming the most contested resource, dependence on rivers that begin in a neighbor's territory is a vulnerability. Kalpasar changes that equation. The reservoir would be fed entirely by rivers that originate within India. It would sit entirely within Gujarat. No upstream neighbor could dam it, divert it, or weaponize it. For a country that has watched China build dams on the Brahmaputra and argued for decades over Indus water sharing with Pakistan, a self-contained reserve of 8 billion cubic meters inside your own borders has strategic value that goes well beyond irrigation statistics. That logic does not appear in feasibility studies. It appears in private planning assessments and in the subtext of political speeches. It is part of why the project keeps resurfacing despite the obstacles. Water security is not just about supply, it is about control. So why hasn't it been built? 50 years is a long time for an idea to sit on a shelf. Part of the answer is cost, and the cost keeps climbing. In 2022, the estimate stood at around 1 lakh crore rupees. By 2026, it had risen to 1.33 lakh crore, above $14 billion. That is the figure before construction begins. Anyone who has watched large Indian infrastructure projects knows the pattern. Estimates at the planning stage are almost never the estimates at completion. Steel prices move, land acquisition drags, court challenges pause work for years, contractors renegotiate. A project priced at 14 billion could easily reach 20 or 25 by the time water fills the reservoir. And with a dam, this complex, cost overruns are not a risk. They are close to a certainty. Then there is time. Gujarat's government has said construction would take about 8 years after approval. Independent engineers put the figure closer to 15, with completion no earlier than the mid-2030s, and that assumes clearance comes quickly and funding holds. Neither is guaranteed. A project that has spent 50 years as a proposal is not likely to suddenly move fast. The environmental clearance alone could take several years. Land acquisition along the coast, resettlement of affected fishing communities, and the endless review of a structure with catastrophic failure potential all add delay on top of delay. There's a deeper reason too, one that's harder to put a number on. No one has ever built anything exactly like this. The Dutch built in calmer water. Every other major sea barrier in the world was built in gentler tides, shallower sediment, or without cyclone and earthquake risk stacked on top of each other. Kalpasar would be the first structure of its kind in an environment this hostile. That means every engineering decision carries uncertainty that can't be fully modeled in advance. You can simulate tidal loads, you can test seabed samples, but you cannot fully predict how 60 kilometers of dam will behave over decades against forces this extreme until it exists. And by then, it is too late to change the design. That uncertainty is why the Dutch partnership matters so much, and why it also isn't enough. The letter of intent, signed in 2026, gives India access to the best coastal engineers alive. It gives credibility to a project that skeptics have dismissed for half a century. But letter of intent is not a construction contract. It is a promise to study, advise, and cooperate. The Dutch have every reason to be cautious. Their reputation is built on barriers that held. Attaching their name to a project that could become the most expensive engineering failure in Indian history is a risk they will manage carefully. The cooperation is real. The commitment to actually build is still India's alone. So where does that leave Kalpasar in 2026? The detailed project report is in its final stage. Environmental clearance has been formally sought. The Dutch are advising. The Prime Minister has attached his name to it. Cost estimates are rising, and the Gulf is still open. Tides still rushing in and out twice a day. 4 rivers still pouring fresh water uselessly into the salt. Everything is in motion, and nothing is decided. The people watching most closely are not in Delhi or Amsterdam. They are the farmers of Saurashtra staring at cracked fields, and the fishing families along the Gulf who know that if the dam is built, their water will change forever. One group gains a lake, the other loses a sea. Both have been waiting for someone to decide which future is worth the cost. Consider what 8 billion cubic meters actually means, because the number is hard to hold in your head. That's enough water to cover the entire city of Mumbai to a depth of over 10 meters. It's more than 3 times the storage of India's largest existing reservoir. Spread across 2,000 square kilometers, the lake would be larger than many small countries. From the road running along the top of the dam, you would not be able to see the far shore. On one side, fresh water stretching to the horizon. On the other, the churning brown sea it was whaled off from. 2 different worlds separated by 60 kilometers of concrete. The road itself is worth pausing on, because it changes the map of Gujarat in a way most people underestimate. Right now, getting from the Saurashtra Peninsula to the industrial belt of South Gujarat means driving around the entire Gulf, 240 kilometers. Half a day of travel for what is, as the crow flies, a short distance. The dam-top highway would collapse that to 60 kilometers. For freight, for commuters, for the movement of goods between 2 of Gujarat's most productive zones, that is a transformation on its own. Some economists argue the road alone could justify a meaningful share of the project's cost, independent of the water. Whether that math holds depends entirely on the dam holding, which brings every conversation back to the same unresolved question. There's also the energy piece, and here the plan gets ambitious to the point of speculation. A tidal range of 11 meters is a curse for construction and a gift for power generation. Water rushing through turbines twice a day, driven by one of the highest tidal ranges on the planet, could produce a steady stream of electricity. Tidal power plants exist elsewhere, but they are small and few. Building one into a 60-kilometer sea dam would put India in rare company. The engineering to do it, while also managing flushing, flood control, and freshwater storage in the same structure, is staggeringly complex. Every function the dam performs competes with the others. You cannot flush salt out and generate maximum tidal power and hold the reservoir at a stable level all at once. Every gain in one purpose costs you in another. That is the hidden difficulty of a multi-purpose mega-project. It is not one machine, it is 5 machines fighting each other inside one wall. And underneath all of it sits the thing no feasibility report can fully account for. This is a 50-year-old idea, and 50-year-old ideas carry the weight of every year they went unbuilt. The people who first proposed Kalpasar in 1975 are mostly gone. The Gujarat they imagined is not the Gujarat that exists now. The state is wealthier, more industrial, more water-stressed, and more politically motivated to prove it can do what no one else has. That motivation is a powerful force. It is also the exact condition under which countries build things they cannot afford or maintain, because the symbol matters more than the sums. India has built symbols before. Some became lifelines, others became warnings. So the question that hangs over Kalpasar is not really whether India can build a dam across the sea. With enough money, enough time, and enough Dutch engineering, almost anything can be built. The real question is whether it should, and whether the version that eventually gets built will resemble the one on paper, or will be a compromised, over-budget, delayed shadow of the promise. 50 years of waiting suggests caution. The signed letter of intent, the finalized report, and a prime minister staking his name on it suggest momentum. Both things are true at once, and that tension is exactly where the project sits today. Out in the Gulf of Khambhat, nothing has changed yet. The tide still climbs 11 meters up the mudflats and falls back twice a day. The Narmada and the Mahi still empty their fresh water into the salt, where it disappears. The fishing boats still go out. The farmers of Saurashtra still watch the sky for rain that comes late or not at all. Somewhere in a government office, engineers are running the last simulations, and lawyers are preparing the next round of clearance filings. And a decision that has been postponed for half a century is inching toward a point where it can no longer be postponed. Build it, and India reshapes its own coastline and locks away a freshwater reserve no neighbor can touch. Leave it, and the water keeps flowing into the sea while the land beside it goes dry. The Gulf has waited 50 years for answer. It is about to get one.